A white courthouse deputy grabs a black woman by the hair and drags her like she doesn't belong, mocking her, stealing her badge, calling her sweetheart. But in 3 minutes, she's going to step into that courtroom, not as a victim, but as the presiding judge. And the system that protected him is about to crack open. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. It started like any other morning. The sky hung low over the courthouse, wrapped in a silver fog that made everything feel quieter, like the city itself was holding its breath. The leaves had just begun to change, crisp yellows and burnt oranges gathering at the edges of the stone steps leading to the entrance. On mornings like this, people walked slower without knowing why, as if even time had paused to witness something it didn't yet understand. A silver sedan pulled up to the curb, its engine cutting softly. The driver's door opened with care, and out stepped Judge Althia Brooks. She closed the door gently behind her, not with hesitation, but with intention. Her gray wool suit was tailored to perfection, crisp lines, no frills. Her heels, low and elegant, struck the pavement with a rhythm that didn't beg attention, but commanded respect. Her natural hair was full, coiled and proud, framing her face like a crown that needed no permission. She didn't wear jewelry. No rings, no earrings, no distractions. Only a slim brown leather briefcase in one hand. In the other, nothing at all. Althea didn't walk like a woman who needed validation. She moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had long stopped asking to be accepted. Every step up those courthouse stairs was its own act of resistance, its own quiet triumph. She wasn't here to prove anything. She was here to do her job, one she had earned over decades of resilience, precision, and 1,000 silent battles that left no scars but changed everything. She reached the front entrance and paused. The building towered above her, carved stone and glass reflecting a dull sky. The metal detectors inside buzzed faintly. Civil servants passed through with plastic bins and nervous glances. Lawyers checked their watches, clerks clutched folders to their chests like shields. The air smelled of old coffee and fresh paper. Normal, familiar, boring, but something inside her chest pulled tight, like the tension before a string. She walked in. The soft echo of her heels against the polished marble floors greeted the vast lobby. High ceilings stretched upward like questions left unanswered. A long row of fluorescent lights flickered above. Their buzzing joined the symphony of muted coughs, shuffling feet, and the beat of security scanners. To most, this was just Tuesday, but Althea had long learned to listen when the air changed, and this morning it had. The security checkpoint was bustling. A young woman in a navy pantsuit fumbled with her heels in the bin. An older man removed his belt and grumbled about bureaucracy. But none of that mattered when Althea stepped forward. Not because of who she was, but because of who was watching. Deputy Troy Keller stood with one arm leaning casually on the X-ray machine, the other resting near his hip radio like a sheriff in an old western. Mid-40s, pale, buzz-cut, with the kind of posture that made space feel smaller around him. His uniform fit a little too tightly around his midsection, the badge on his chest gleaming with pride he hadn't earned that day. He chewed gum with his mouth slightly open, and watched people move through the scanner like they were intruders in his kingdom. Then he saw her. Althea didn't flinch. She didn't slow her step. She walked toward the checkpoint the same way she had walked into courtrooms for years, measured, poised, immune to petty performances of power. But she noticed the change immediately. Keller straightened just slightly. His eyes narrowed. His jaw moved with a touch more tension. And when she came within 5 feet, he raised one hand sharply in front of her chest. "Ma'am," he said, drawing the word out like it tasted sour. "I need you to step out of line." The noise of the lobby seemed to dim. Althea blinked once. Her eyes locked onto his, calm but immovable. "Is there an issue?" she asked. Her voice was low, even. No edge, no plea. Just a question, as direct as a gavel drop. Keller took a step forward. He was taller than her, heavier, louder. But none of that mattered in her gaze. Still, he tried to assert something, anything. "You've got no visible ID," he said, louder this time, making sure others in line could hear him. "Can't let you through like that." Althea slowly reached into the inside pocket of her blazer. Her motions were deliberate, careful, the way black professionals learn to be in uniform spaces. She pulled out her federal judicial badge, held it with 2 fingers, and extended it toward him. "This should suffice," she said. Keller didn't even glance at the badge. He snatched it from her hand and shoved it into his breast pocket. His eyes slid past her shoulder, as if she'd already disappeared. Something in her jaw tightened, but only for a moment. "I'd like that return," she said, calm as ever. Keller smiled, not the kind that came from joy, but the kind that came from entitlement. "You in a rush, sweetheart." The word hit like a slap with no sound. Her face didn't change, but the room around her did. The young woman who had fumbled with her heels now watched from the corner of her eye. A man in line shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Silence grew roots. "I need to get to the 4th floor, Althea said, her voice firm but never raised. "Courtroom 12. She didn't elaborate. She didn't soften the words or pad them with explanation. Just the facts. That was how she had always carried herself. Clean, measured, direct. But even truth can sound like defiance to the wrong ears. Deputy Keller shifted his weight and leaned in, the corner of his mouth twitching with something just shy of contempt. "Then you'll follow my procedure," he said, with a sudden authority that rang louder than the moment required. "Random check. Standard protocol. Come with me." There was no protocol. Not for her. Not for this. Althea didn't move. Not because she was afraid, but because she was thinking, measuring, calculating. She had spent a lifetime doing that in rooms where she wasn't supposed to belong. She understood that silence could be as sharp as steel when used right. And in that stillness, she saw him for what he was. Not just a man with a bag, but a man who had never been told no by someone who looked like... Her eyes didn't blink, her hands didn't shake, but something inside her began to shift. She could say it right there. She could name herself, say the words he didn't expect. "I'm the judge." She could flash her title like a weapon, demand her badge back, call for his supervisor. She had the power, but that wasn't the point, because she knew, deeply, intimately, that if she had been any other black woman, one without the robe, without the chambers upstairs, without the federal clearance, that none of that would have mattered. And that's exactly why she stayed silent. Because what mattered wasn't what she was about to do. What mattered was what he would choose to do, believing she had no power at all. So she stepped forward, not in surrender, not in acceptance, but in cold, watchful defiance. She gave him just enough to show herself, and waited to see how far he'd go. That was the moment. Deputy Keller placed his hand on her arm. It wasn't a gentle gesture. It wasn't protocol. It was a grip meant to humiliate, to stake claim. Not strong enough to bruise, but just hard enough to remind her who he thought he was. His fingers pressed into the fabric of her blazer. His breath was close now. Coffee stain, sour, insistent. "This way," he said, like a man giving orders, not directions. The crowd kept moving. The line behind them shuffled. Nobody intervened. Nobody questioned. Only one person seemed to register the unease. Young, white, female officer near the scanner. No more than a rookie, judging by the way her eyes widened before she quickly looked away. They walked in silence. Down a side corridor, away from the bustle of the main floor, the marble walls gave way to something colder. Blank surfaces, buzzing fluorescence, a kind of institutional hush that swallowed footsteps. The hallway smelled like dust and over-polished tile. Each step echoed a little too loudly. Althea didn't look at him. She didn't ask where they were going. She already knew. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't about procedure. It was about power, his need to assert it, and her refusal to yield it. And in that sterile corridor, beneath humming lights and cracked ceiling tiles, a decision formed, not one born from fear, but from clarity. She was going to let this play out. She was going to let him cross every line. Because sometimes, the only way to bring a system to its knees is to let it think it still has the upper hand. The hallway grew colder with every step. As Althea walked beside Deputy Keller, her heels tapped against tile that no longer felt like the courthouse she had walked through hundreds of times before. The fluorescent lights above buzzed in a way that grated against her senses. Sharp, humming, relentless. The polished stone gave way to institutional linoleum. The walls here were narrower, lower, and painted that same muted beige color so many buildings used when they wanted to forget a room even existed. The place didn't hum with history like the main hall did. It felt sterilized, like a space designed to erase whoever entered it. Althea said nothing. She let him lead. The rookie officer followed behind them, her steps slower, hesitant. Althea didn't turn to look, but she could feel her presence like a question mark trailing too close to disappear but too quiet to matter. The young woman was watching, unsure if what she was seeing was wrong, unsure what she was allowed to do about it. That was always how it started, with someone watching and doing nothing. They reached a nondescript door near the end of the hall. Keller opened it with a kind of carelessness that suggested ownership, not permission. The room beyond was small and unremarkable. A single desk shoved against the wall, a hard metal chair bolted to the floor, a security camera mounted in the upper corner, red light blinking faintly. There were no windows, no clocks, no signals of time or place. Keller motioned toward the chair. "Sit," he ordered. His voice had lost its fake courtesy. It was sharp now, clipped, designed to provoke. Althea remained standing just inside the threshold. "This is unnecessary," she said evenly. "There's no legal cause for a secondary screening. And you're in possession of my federal badge?" Keller didn't answer. He closed the door behind them. The click of the lock wasn't loud, but it settled like thunder in the silence. He moved to the side of the room, arms crossed. The rookie officer stood just outside the doorway, still not entering, still not leaving. She lingered, like a ghost in training, unsure whether to vanish or bear witness. Keller's eyes roamed over Althea again, slow and unapologetic. He nodded toward the chair once more. "I said sit." Althea remained still, not defiant, not panicked, just steady. "I'm a federal judge," she said, calmly, "and I'm done entertaining whatever game this is." Keller stepped toward her, close enough that the stale smell of coffee and dried sweat hit the back of her throat. His frame filled the room like a storm cloud. His smile was gone now. What remained was something colder. "Judge?" he said under his breath. "Right. Sure." She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. Her hands remained at her sides, her spine straight. She had faced worse than this. She had outlasted men like him, but that didn't mean she was numb. What happened next didn't last more than 2 seconds, but it would stay with her longer than some memories that had taken years to form. Without warning, without a word, Deputy Keller reached forward and grabbed her by the hair. It was one motion, calculated, vicious, and entirely silent. His fingers tangled into her natural curls, not like someone restraining, but like someone claiming. Her body jerked backward as her head snapped in his grip. Her neck strained, and for a moment she lost her breath. Not because of the force, but because of the insult, the intimacy of it, the utter indignity. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her jaw clenched, and her breath caught behind her teeth like a dam she refused to let break. Her eyes burned, not from pain, but from the white-hot fury of 1,000 times she'd had to pretend something didn't hurt just to stay safe. Stay composed. Stay in the room. She reached up, not to fight him off, but to keep her balance as her heels slid half an inch across the floor. She didn't fall. She wouldn't give him that. "Get your hands off me," she said, low and tight, like a hiss through broken glass. Keller let go, chuckling under his breath like he'd just told a crude joke. "You people get so sensitive about everything," he muttered. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. It didn't just hang there. It pressed against the walls. Even the buzzing lights seemed to pause, listening. The rookie officer took a step back from the doorway. Her face paled, her eyes wide, her mouth opening slightly, like she might say something. But again, she didn't. She watched, just watched. Keller walked over to the desk and picked up Althia's badge. He didn't hand it to her. He tossed it across the metal surface, like it was an old receipt. "That," he said smugly. "You're free to go." Althia stared at the badge, the small emblem of her authority now lying face down on a table that smelled faintly of bleach and neglect. She didn't speak. She didn't react. She walked over, picked it up with 2 fingers, brushed a single strand of hair from her face, and turned. Her legs carried her out of that room on muscle memory alone. The rookie officer stepped aside quickly, eyes darting to the floor, then back to the door like it might vanish behind her. Althia didn't look back. Not because she wasn't furious, but because she wasn't done. The hallway looked the same as it had 5 minutes earlier. Same flickering lights, same peeling paint, same dead air, but nothing was the same. Something inside her had fractured. Not broken, but cracked, just wide enough for the fire to rise. She walked back toward the main atrium like a woman walking uphill against a wind only she could feel. Her posture was still upright, her stride still steady, but inside her chest, something trembled, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of the choice ahead. She could go upstairs, pretend nothing happened, lead her docket like always. She could wear the robe and let the morning fade into a story she told no one. That would be safer, easier, professional. But that would also be surrender. And she hadn't spent her entire life learning to survive these rooms, just to let them erase her now. As she neared the lobby, the noise of the courthouse returned, a printer whirring behind glass, distant conversation near the elevators, the low murmur of civil machinery grinding on, unaware of the violence just committed in its shadow. No one looked at her. No one noticed the disarray in her hair, or the strain in her jaw, or the storm beginning to bloom in her eyes. That was the part that hurt most. Not the fingers in her scalp, not the lack of apology, not even the silence of the young officer who didn't step in. It was the indifference, the invisibility. She passed a man holding a briefcase, who nodded politely, oblivious. A clerk with a folder walked by without lifting her eyes. The same people who would stand when she walked into courtroom 12 wouldn't have paused now to ask if she was okay. That was the truth of it. That badge she'd worked so hard to earn meant nothing when the uniform didn't see it. Her power didn't matter when the wrong man didn't care who he was touching. And her dignity, her voice, her presence, was only protected if she protected it herself. Althea stepped into the elevator and turned to face the mirror-mineralized doors. Her reflection looked back. A single curl of hair stuck out near her temple, still disrupted from where he had pulled her. She didn't tuck it back. She let it sit there, wild and unresolved. Let them see it. Let them wonder. Because when she stepped into that courtroom next, it wouldn't be just as a judge. It would be as a reckoning. Althea stepped back into the main hall, and the world didn't flinch. It was as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just been yanked by the hair like a disobedient child in a windowless room, as if her badge had not been tossed like garbage, as if the foundation of dignity hadn't been cracked beneath her feet. The courthouse continued breathing in shallow, indifferent rhythms. Phones rang in distant officers, metal detectors buzzed. The whir of a copy machine echoed faintly near the public defender's suite. Somewhere a man sneezed, and someone laughed in reply. And through it all, no one looked at her. That was what struck deepest. Not the grip on her scalp or the voice that called her sweetheart with rot in its tone. It was this: how easily a woman could be harmed and then released back into the world like nothing had happened. How the moment could vanish before it even had time to settle in someone else's memory. She walked slowly, deliberately, each step echoing not in volume, but in weight. She passed a young intern, blonde, mid-20s, carrying a stack of legal pads so high he could barely see over them. He smiled as she passed, friendly, unaware. Another woman, a clerk she'd seen often near courtroom 9, scurried by in flats and earbuds, humming along to something no one else could hear. Neither of them noticed anything off, not the tension in Althia's shoulders, not the tight grip she had on the badge in her left hand, not the single curl of hair that still dangled out of place, brushing her cheek like an unanswered question. She passed two attorneys leaning near the vending machine. One of them glanced up, gave a vague nod of acknowledgement, and returned to a conversation about scheduling conflicts. They didn't see her, not truly. To them, she was just another body passing through a space designed to move bodies quickly, even the ones that broke. Her feet reached the elevator. The metal doors opened without hesitation, polished and reflective. She stepped inside and turned to face them. The moment the doors closed, the noise of the building died. In the silence, she was alone again, with herself, her badge, and the decision pressing against her ribs like a held breath. She looked in the mirror. The woman who stared back didn't cry. Her eyes weren't wet. Her lip wasn't trembling. But her reflection didn't lie. Her back was straighter than usual, her jaw tighter. Her grip on the badge was white-knuckled, and the hair, still out of place, refused to be ignored. It was a small thing, that single coil, but it wasn't just about hair. It was about control. It was about visibility. It was about dignity stolen in silence. She raised her hand, paused near her ear, and almost brushed the strand back. Almost. But she stopped. Let it stay. Let it speak. Because if no one else was going to notice what had happened to her, then they were going to have to look at what was left behind. The elevator rose. And so did the fire. The hallway on the fourth floor felt different from everything below it. Not because of what had changed, but because of what hadn't. It was quiet, clean, carpeted in a way that suggested power didn't have to prove itself here. Power just was. The ceilings were higher, the air cooler, and the people more rehearsed in their silence. This was the professional floor, the realm of judges, senior clerks, legal advisors, and chambers with nameplates etched in brass. Althia walked forward like she belonged here. Because she did. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel protected by these walls. Not really. The illusion had been shattered by a man who didn't even ask her name. A man who looked at her, listened to her calm authority, saw her badge, and still decided she didn't belong. Her robe was here. Her title was on the door. Her office was filled with credentials, law books, case files, but none of that had stopped what happened downstairs. The doors to her chambers opened without resistance. Her judicial assistant wasn't at his desk, probably still prepping courtroom 12 for the morning docket. The space felt untouched, organized, waiting. She set her briefcase down without ceremony. On the far wall, behind a pane of glass, her black robe hung neatly pressed on its wooden hanger. It looked like armor, draped, elegant, reverent, a symbol of everything she had worked for. Every night she had studied late into the morning, every client she had defended, every sexist aside she had ignored, every breath she had measured in rooms where her voice was doubted by design. But she didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, she walked toward the private washroom adjacent to her office and stepped inside. The door swung closed behind her, soft and final. She turned on the light and stared into the mirror. The same mirror she had looked into 100 times before court. The same mirror that had seen her fix lipstick, tuck loose curls, smooth the collar of her blouse, square her shoulders. But today, she didn't adjust anything. She didn't touch her face. She didn't reach for the curl still out of place on her forehead. She leaned forward, resting both hands on the porcelain sink. the cool surface grounding her. What happened to you was not your fault. But what you do next will be. That thought cut through the noise in her head like a chisel. She could wear the robe, walk into court, preside. No one would ever know. Maybe the officer would forget it happened. Maybe the rookie wouldn't say anything. Maybe the hallway wouldn't echo the sound of her heels any differently. Or maybe that was the problem. Maybe it would all continue. Unless she made sure it didn't. She took one deep breath, then another, then stood straight. She didn't look away from her reflection. She didn't flinch. And when she turned to leave the washroom, she did so without tucking the hair back. Let it stay. Let it burn. Her assistant looked up just as she stepped into the outer office. "Judge Brooks," he said, startled. I didn't hear you come in. Courtroom 12's nearly ready. The clerk just confirmed media presence. Looks like 2 outlets sent photographers." He held out a printed docket, already organized with tabs and handwritten notes. His professionalism was eager, practiced. A young man doing his best to keep up. "I'll enter from the main floor," she said. He blinked. "A front? I mean, yes, Your Honor. But are you sure? We can still route you through chambers like usual. Quicker, quieter." She looked him in the eye. "No, I want them to see me walk in." His mouth opened slightly as if to ask why, but he knew better than to question a directive from the bench. He nodded quickly. She stepped past him and exited the chambers. The hallway beyond bustled with subtle movement. Law clerks whispered in pairs. A bailiff stood near a supply cart. An IT technician adjusted something in a courtroom doorway. People noticed her as she passed. Not because she was out of place, but because she was never usually seen here at this hour. Judges entered through side routes, elevated entrances, private staircases. They did not walk the path of defendants, observers, or the press. And yet, here she was. She passed a group of young interns standing by the stairwell. Women, one man, all carrying notebooks and backpacks. One of them, a black woman no older than 22, met Althia's gaze and froze. Their eyes locked. Althia didn't smile. She didn't nod at first. Then, slowly, deliberately, she did. Just once. A silent signal that said, "I see you. I've been where you are. Watch closely. Learn everything. You'll need it." The young woman swallowed hard and nodded back. Her hands trembled around her notebook. Althia descended the staircase one step at a time. Each footfall was soft but deliberate. By the time she reached the ground level, the courtroom doors loomed ahead. The same heavy oak doors she had walked through 1,000 times. But never like this. Never through the public side. Never without her robe. Today was different. Today, she was not entering as the safe, distant figure behind the bench. She was entering as the woman who had been touched without consent, dismissed without reason, disrespected without shame. She passed through the outer lobby. The noise of the press adjusting camera equipment drifted through the air. People looked up. None of them knew what she had endured that morning. But they were about to find out what she had become. Not just a judge. Not just a voice of the court. But a reckoning, walking toward her bench like a storm wrapped in silk and memory. Courtroom 12 was full. Every seat in the gallery was taken, reporters hunched over notepads and phones, attorneys whispering over yellow legal pads, clerks adjusting microphones on the tables. There was a charge in the air, a static pressure that had settled quietly but undeniably into the wood grain and stone. It wasn't panic, something else. Anticipation, without an anchor. Everyone was waiting, but no one could say for what. The skylight above cast pale light through a pane of dusty glass, illuminating the aisle between the benches like a stage. It stretched from the grand double doors at the back of the room all the way to the bench, where the judge would normally appear. Normally, the side door would open at the last moment. Normally, Judge Althia Brooks would enter from chambers in her robe, flanked by routine and protected by formality. Normally, everything was predictable. But not today. Because today, the grand double doors open from the main floor. And everything changed. At first, no one noticed. Then someone near the back turned, confused. Then two more. Then, the whisper of recognition passed like a ripple, turning heads and silencing breath. There she was, standing in the center of the doorway. No robe, no escort, no file folder in hand. Just her, tall, poised, commanding the room without saying a single word. Her heels stood on the marble just beyond the threshold, backlit by the soft gray light from the hallway. For a second, she didn't move. For a second, the entire courtroom held its breath. Then she stepped forward. Click, click, click. Each step echoed like punctuation against the silence. Her hair was still disturbed, one coil still untucked, still bent from the grip of Deputy Keller's hand. She hadn't fixed it. She hadn't smoothed the marks of that humiliation away. It was still there, unhidden, unrepaired, a living wound turned into a visible statement. She walked slowly, without ceremony. She passed the pews like a procession of one. Her face didn't flinch. Her eyes didn't dart. Her hands remained at her sides, fingers relaxed, body anchored in certainty. And still, no one dared to move. She passed row after row. The courtroom, once buzzing with side talk, had fallen into a complete and reverent silence. No one reached for their phones. No one whispered. Even the reporters' cameras resting on their laps froze mid-feigny, unsure whether they were witnessing a courtroom entrance or something more. And then she passed him. Deputy Troy Keller. He stood at the far edge of the room, arms crossed, face rigid, but not with confidence now, with discomfort, with the growing realization that what he had done earlier in a forgotten hallway was now standing in front of the world, unashamed and fully visible. His eyes followed her as she passed. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. And she didn't look at him. Not yet. She ascended the steps toward the bench like she had done countless times before, but today, the rhythm of it fell different. Every inch of elevation seemed symbolic, like she was walking back into herself after having been pulled violently out of her own skin. The bench stood tall before her, the robe laid across the arm of the chair like armor waiting for its warrior. It was neatly folded, deep black against warm oak, heavy with memory. Her hand hovered above it for a breath, and then she picked it up. She didn't rush. One arm slipped into the left sleeve, then the right. She adjusted the collar gently, the movement fluid and purposeful. Her hands smoothed the fabric down the front, not to straighten wrinkles, but to remind herself, and everyone watching, that this robe had not been given to her, she had earned it. Every thread of it was stitched with the sacrifices she had made to sit in that chair, in that room, in that... The curl of hair still dangled freely at her temple. She left it untouched. Let them see it. Let them understand. When she turned to face the courtroom, fully robed, the silence somehow deepened. She took the final step and sat down. Her hands came to rest on the wood of the bench, solid, familiar, grounding. To the side, the clerk, visibly nervous, stood a little straighter. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked to Althea, eyes wide. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said, voice quiet, hesitant. "Docket is prepared for Case 1-831 SAC, Charles versus the City of Mapleton Police Department." The courtroom didn't move. No one scribbled notes. No one adjusted papers. No one blinked. Althea looked out over the gallery. She scanned the crowd, not for recognition, not for allies, not for sympathy. Only for presence. She needed them to see her. Not what she had been made to endure, but what she had refused to erase. She turned to the clerk and nodded once. "Let's begin." Her voice didn't boom. It didn't shake. But it landed like stone on glass, clear, final, undeniable. At that moment, the room reassembled itself around her. It was no longer the scene of a trial. It was the scene of a shift. And every person sitting there, whether lawyer, plaintiff, journalist, or spectator, knew that whatever was about to happen in that courtroom had already begun the moment she walked through the front door. The courtroom stirred back to life, but only slightly. A bailiff stepped forward to announce the case. His voice cracked on the first syllable before regaining balance. The plaintiff's counsel adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began to rise. Even the camera flashes from the press section came softer, slower, like they didn't want to disturb something sacred. But Althia wasn't looking at them. Not yet. Her eyes rested on the prosecution table, then on the defense. Each attorney present had seen hundreds of hearings. They had witnessed objections shouted across aisles, verdicts delivered to gasps and tears. But this was different. This was history written quietly, without fire or fury. It was being carved into the air with the steady posture of a woman who had decided she would not shrink. She could feel him in the room still. Deputy Keller. The man who had grabbed her like she didn't belong, who had humiliated her without fear of consequence, who now stood still, as if the walls themselves had begun to close in around him. She still hadn't looked at him. And that was by design. She let him feel it. Let him feel the widening space between who he thought she was and who she had always been. He fidgeted, crossed his arms tighter, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. But she said nothing. There was no need, because everyone else in that courtroom had already seen what mattered. They had seen her walk through the same doors as any citizen, without title, without robe, without shield. And then they had seen her rise, robe herself in silence, and sit back on the bench, not as someone untouched, but as someone unshaken. It wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. Althea shifted in her seat slightly and looked to the bailiff. "Please call the first witness," she said, voice smooth and firm. The courtroom responded. Movements resumed. A chair was pulled out. Footsteps echoed. A young black man stood to testify, his hand raised to swear in. He glanced at Althea, not with expectation, not with plea, but with quiet acknowledgement. She nodded once, and he sat. Outside, the day moved on. Cars passed the courthouse. Leaves fell from October trees. Pedestrians walked without knowing what had just occurred in that room. But inside every inch of the courtroom, knew that something had shifted. And none of them would forget the moment justice walked through the front door, unapologetic, unbroken, and utterly undeniable. The courtroom had settled, but no one felt at ease. Reporters lined the back row with cameras idle in their laps. Attorneys sat straight in their chairs, shuffling through pages that didn't need reviewing, adjusting ties and collars as if they were bracing for a temperature shift no one could explain. Something about the air had changed. The hush wasn't just procedural, it was anticipatory, like they were all holding their breath for a reason none of them could name yet. The clerk stood and spoke. Case number 18031, Samaye, Charles versus the City of Mapleton Police Department. Two lawyers rose from the plaintiff's side. Then a man stood, mid-40s, black, tall, dressed in a blazer that had clearly been chosen with care but carried the slight wrinkles of a father who had barely slept the night before. Raymond Charles walked toward the stand slowly, as though every step bore a history no one else could see. He raised his right hand, swore in, and sat. The courtroom quieted again, not from any command, but from the presence of grief. The plaintiff's attorney stepped forward. "Mr. Charles, would you please tell the court what happened on the afternoon of June 14th?" Raymond nodded. His voice was low at first, but clear. "My son Elijah was attending a protest that day, peaceful, organized by students at the local college. It was about police use of force, especially on young black men." He paused, eyes drifting up toward the ceiling for a brief second before returning to the courtroom. He was only 18, just graduated high school 2 weeks before. His mother and I had planned a small party. Nothing big. He wanted to study journalism, said he wanted to tell the stories the news always got wrong. A faint rustle moved through the gallery, followed by stillness. Raymond's hand moved to the edge of the witness box. He gripped it once, then released. I was there too, watching from a few yards away. He didn't know. I just wanted to make sure he was safe. You know how it is. His voice wavered. They marched for almost an hour, stayed on sidewalks. No property damage, no shouting, just signs, chants, college kids doing what they believed in. Then police showed up. No warning, just uniforms, trucks, orders shouted through megaphones. He swallowed hard. My son was holding a sign that said, "We are not a threat." That was all. He wasn't yelling, wasn't touching anyone, just standing. His next words came slower, heavier. And then I saw it. One of the officers came up from behind, grabbed him, slammed him to the ground. No conversation, no restraint, just force, just violence. My boy's body hit the pavement so hard, I heard it before I believed it. Raymond closed his eyes. He didn't get up, not right away. His head turned to the side, and I saw blood on the concrete. His arm. He opened his eyes again, but they were glossy now. I ran. Of course I did. What else could I do? I screamed for them to stop, to let me through, but they pushed me back. One officer told me to stay behind the line. Another grabbed me by the chest and shoved me toward a patrol car. I kept yelling, but nobody listened. His voice cracked. Sorrel was lying in the street like trash, his sign torn, his glasses broken. He wasn't moving. He looked down at the edge of the stand, collecting himself. They finally called paramedics. Took almost 10 minutes. When the ambulance arrived, I rode in the front. The MT told me Elijah had likely suffered a shoulder dislocation and possible nerve damage. He said they'd need imaging to know more. He was trying to be kind, but I could hear the fear under it. The courtroom was silent. No movement, no throat clears, just stillness. Raymond lifted his head again. It's been 4 months now. My son still can't lift his arm above his shoulder. He used to draw every day. Now he can't even hold a pencil without pain. His writing hand shakes. He says his fingers feel like they're made of rubber. He let the silence sit before continuing. I filed a complaint with Internal Affairs. I requested the body cam footage. They told me the camera had malfunctioned, that there was no usable video. They closed the file, called it resolved. He looked toward Judge Brooks, not in plea but in demand. I don't need sympathy. I'm not here to cry. I'm here to be heard, because they want people like my son to disappear. But I won't let that happen, not while I have breath. Her thoughts unmoving on the bench. Her gaze didn't shift. Her jaw didn't tighten, but something beneath her skin vibrated, like pressure beneath marble. She met his eyes and nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Charles," she said. "You've been heard." Her voice carried. Not in volume, but in clarity. The kind of clarity that makes a room remember what truth sounds like. The plaintiff's attorney nodded and stepped back. The defense declined cross-examination. No one wanted to be the one to question a grieving father. Not today. Raymond stepped down from the stand. As he returned to his seat, he didn't look around, but when he passed the prosecution table, every pair of eyes followed him, not out of scrutiny, but reverence. This wasn't testimony. This was testimony turned into witness. While the next witness was being prepared, the courtroom finally exhaled, but just barely. Papers rustled. Lawyers whispered. A pen clicked somewhere near the back row, but the silence still lingered, stretching just enough to keep everyone on edge. Althia remained still. Not stiff. Not detached. Just present. Fully and unmistakably present. And still, she hadn't looked at Keller. Not once. But he was there, standing near the courtroom's side wall, trying to appear casual, as if this were just another hearing, just another day. But it wasn't working. His posture betrayed him, arms crossed too tightly, jaw clenched too visibly, eyes darting to places no one else was watching. He had been there when she walked in. He had seen her hair still unraveled. He had watched her robe herself, step onto the bench, and open the case. And she hadn't said his name, hadn't acknowledged his presence. And that, more than anything, had begun to unnerve him. Because silence, in the hands of a woman like her, was not safety. It was strategy. Althia's hands folded gently atop the bench, fingers laced, thumbs still. She read the docket in front of her, not for distraction, but for pacing. Timing mattered. Witnesses had to be allowed to speak. Truth had to settle before it was upended. She knew that rhythm better than anyone in the room. But underneath it all, the moment was building. And everyone could feel it. The press scribbling faster. The clerk, eyes twitching toward the side hallway. Even the defense attorney, suddenly unable to make eye contact with the judge. Because while the room had watched a father share his pain, the room had also watched a judge hold her silence. And silence, when it carries the truth, doesn't last forever. She tapped once on the desk, not loud, not commanding, but just enough. "We'll recess for 15 minutes, she said. She rose from her seat and turned toward Chambers. The courtroom shifted as people stood. Some filed out quietly. Others lingered, unsure whether stepping outside meant missing what they could feel was coming next. Keller didn't move. Althia walked with the same deliberate pace that had brought her through those main doors. And still, she hadn't looked back. But every person in that room knew. She was coming for something. And when she turned around, justice wouldn't be whispered. It would be named. The courtroom clock ticked quietly, but it might as well have been a war drum. People shifted in their seats, trying not to look like they were waiting for something, but they were. No one spoke above a whisper. Reporters angled their phones just slightly higher, preparing to record but pretending not to. The attorneys at both tables sat stiff and uncertain, folders open but unread. Even the bailiff cleared his throat a little too often. His boots rusted in place. The anticipation was thick, crawling across the polished floors and climbing the gallery walls. Then, finally, she returned. Judge Althia Brooks stepped through the chamber doors, not briskly, not slowly, but with the same cadence she always used. That, in itself, was stunning. There was no added flair, no dramatic posture. She wasn't walking in like someone preparing for a confrontation. She was walking in like someone who had already survived it. She returned to the bench and sat. The room went absolutely still. The leather of her chair whispered softly as she settled. Then she raised her eyes. "Deputy Keller," she said evenly, her voice clean as glass, "please approach the bench." The sentence was simple, short, sharp, but it struck like thunder. People stopped breathing. One woman in the gallery clutched the strap of her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. A man near the back whispered, "Oh my God," but no one shushed him, because it wasn't irreverent, it was honest. Keller stood frozen. His body shifted, but he didn't move. For a split second he looked like a man deciding whether to run. But he didn't. Slowly he moved toward the front of the courtroom. His boots made a dull, dragging sound against the floor. He didn't lift his feet all the way. His hands twitched at his sides. His face had gone pale, jaw clenched so tight the veins in his neck showed with every step. This was not the same man who had gripped Judge Brooks by the hair hours earlier. That man had swaggered. This one flinched. He stopped at the bench and stood stiffly. Althea didn't move. "Deputy Keller," she began, her voice calm, "how many random searches have you conducted since January?" He blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. I don't know the exact number, Your Honor." She raised an eyebrow. "Estimate it." He hesitated, eyes darting left and right, like the answer might be floating somewhere in the air. "Maybe 20, he said, though it sounded more like a guess than a fact. Her gaze didn't change. "You filed 42 incident reports involving citizen contact since January. Of those, 12 included some form of detainment, 9 involved physical interaction, 8 were flagged internally for the use of aggressive or inappropriate language." His mouth opened, but nothing came out. She continued, measured and unshaken. "Of those 9 physical complaints, Deputy Keller, how many involved women of color?" Keller's lips twitched. He blinked again, slowly, deliberately. I wasn't keeping track of that," he said, barely audible. "I was," Althia replied. And the room went completely still again. 9. The number hung in the room like a thundercloud, ready to burst. Judge Brooks didn't shout it. She didn't slam her gavel. She didn't need to. Her calm was more unnerving than outrage ever could be. She had done what systems never expected. She paid attention. She tracked patterns. She remembered names. She had receipts. "Each complaint," she said, eyes fixed on Keller, "was filed by a woman of color. 3 described inappropriate touching. 2 explicitly stated you grabbed them by their hair or arm. 1 used the words humiliated in public. All were dismissed or marked inconclusive within 24 hours. None were escalated to disciplinary review." Keller shifted uncomfortably, swallowing hard. His eyes flicked to the back of the room, maybe hoping for backup, maybe hoping this wasn't real. She went on. "This morning, you stopped me before I entered the building. You refused to review the identification I presented. You removed it from my person without cause. You led me to a restricted hallway with no surveillance. You placed your hand on me, forcefully. You threw my federal credentials onto a metal table. You told me I was being..." Each word sliced clean, factual, undeniable. "I did not raise my voice," she said. "I did not retaliate. I did not identify myself in that moment." Now her voice dropped ever so slightly, not in volume, but in emotional gravity. "Because I wanted to see how far you'd go." The courtroom collectively shivered. That wasn't just power. That was precision. That was what accountability looked like, dressed in black robes, and patience. Keller shook his head slightly, but he didn't speak. He looked like he wanted to, but every word seemed to catch in his throat. There was no script for this, no training manual, no department-issued guide on what to do when the woman you manhandled turns out to be the presiding judge of the federal courtroom you're standing in. And then, the final blow. "You didn't know who I was," she said, "and that's the problem." The silence that followed was deafening. She let it sit for several seconds, let it sink in, not just for Keller, but for the gallery, the officers, the attorneys, the reporters. She wasn't just speaking to him. She was speaking to every person who had ever witnessed harm and explained it away with the words, "He didn't know." And now he did. She turned her head slightly toward the clerk. "Deputy Keller is hereby ordered into administrative detainment, effective immediately, pending formal internal investigation." The words didn't sound angry. They sounded inevitable. 2 uniformed officers moved from their station along the courtroom wall. They approached with steady, practiced hands, not aggressive, but unflinching. Keller stepped back. "Wait," he began, but he was already being turned. His arms pulled gently but firmly behind him. The cold, metallic snap of handcuffs rang through the room like a bell. A few gasps echoed from the gallery. But no one moved to stop it. And no one said it was wrong. The handcuffs gleamed in the courtroom lights, resting cold against Keller's wrists. His head was down now, his jaw slack. The redness in his cheeks had drained entirely, replaced by a kind of pale disbelief. The look of a man who had lived his entire career in impunity, only to discover in one stunning afternoon that the rules had never actually been suspended, just untested. The officers didn't push or drag him. They simply walked him through the well of the courtroom, past the gallery, past the clerk's desk, past the exact spot where Judge Brooks had stood, violated but silent, not hours earlier. And as they exited through the back door, something happened that no one expected. No one clapped. No one cheered. No one shouted in triumph. They didn't need to. Because justice doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes, it arrives as a silence so powerful it leaves your ears ringing. Judge Brooks remained seated. She didn't shift, didn't exhale, didn't mark the moment with even the slightest gesture. She just watched. Not with vengeance, not even with vindication, but with authority. True authority. Earned not by title, but by integrity. After a long, waited pause, she finally spoke. "We will now resume the matter of Charles versus Mapleton PD," she said, as if the afternoon hadn't just ruptured the courthouse's history in half. The attorneys blinked. Folders were reopened. Pens tapped paper. But none of it felt routine. Everyone knew this was a courtroom transformed. Her clerk cleared his throat and called the next witness. The courtroom moved forward, but differently, with reverence, with a gravity that wasn't present before. In the gallery, Raymond Charles sat still, eyes locked on the bench. He didn't nod, he didn't smile, but a single tear ran down his face, quiet, unnoticed, except by the woman on the bench who glanced at him once, just once, and gave him what every father who ever lost faith in the system deserved. She gave him belief. Because that's what had shifted in the room. A belief. Not that everything had changed. Not that justice had been perfected. But that someone finally had stood up. And not just for herself. For all the women who had filed complaints that went nowhere. For all the voices that were too hoarse from screaming to be heard anymore. For every victim who was told to calm down, to comply, to accept. Judge Althia Brooks didn't take the system apart with rage. She disassembled it quietly, firmly, publicly, one truth at a time. And from that bench, she didn't just make a ruling. She made history. The air in her chambers felt heavier than it had that morning. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was exposure, like something sacred had been cracked open. And now every shadow in the room seemed to lean a little closer. Althea stepped inside without saying a word to her assistant. She closed the door quietly behind her, letting the latch click shut with finality. Her heels barely made a sound on the floor, as if even they knew this wasn't a moment for echo. And then she saw it. A manila folder. It sat in the center of her desk, perfectly placed, as if delivered by unseen hands. No name, no label, no seal, just there, waiting. She paused, heart tightening in her chest, then walked toward it. Each step felt like stepping deeper into something she wouldn't be able to walk back from. She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. She opened it. The first page made her stop breathing. It was dated more than a decade ago. A use-of-force complaint filed by a woman named Bernice Holloway, African-American, mid-30s. She had reported being pulled aside in a courthouse hallway, patted down aggressively, her ID taken and never returned. And then, those same words Althea herself had nearly spoken that morning. He yanked my hair like I was property. The perpetrator, Deputy Troy Keller. She turned the page. Another report, this time from a woman named Keisha Turner. Similar language, similar setting, same outcome, no investigation, internal handling only. Next page. Then another. And another. By the seventh, her hands had begun to shake, not from surprise, no, that had faded by the third page, but from the recognition that this wasn't an isolated pattern. This was an ecosystem, a design. Each report carried a familiar rhythm. The woman speaks up, the man denies, the institution shrugs, and someone signs their name to that shrug like it was gospel. 14 women, all black, all dismissed. Althea felt the bile rise in her throat as she reached the final page. Then she saw the signature. Alan Wexler, her former mentor, her first judicial clerkship, the man who once told her, "You don't need to raise your voice, Althea. Just raise the law high enough that they can't duck beneath it." She had believed him, looked up to him, had him listed on her first bench confirmation materials as a personal reference. And here he was, signature after signature, dismissing complaints that sounded exactly like hers, signing off on Keller's impunity like it was routine housekeeping. Her eyes scanned the initials again, needing to see if, somehow, it was a mistake. It wasn't. He had buried them. Every single one. Her mouth parted, but no words came, only a whisper escaped, fragile and sharp. New. Not just Keller. Not just the security office. But the judges, the ones in robes, the ones who were supposed to be the guardians. The ones who smiled at her every morning as she passed them in the hallway. They knew. The folder felt radioactive in her hands. She couldn't close it, not yet. The pages demanded to be seen, not just read, but understood. Witnessed, the kind of witnessing that broke illusions and changed everything afterward. She moved to the edge of her desk and sat, the folder still open across her lap like a confession. The silence in her chambers buzzed, not with noise, but with betrayal. Heavy, metallic, inescapable. She skimmed the margins of the reports again. Some had annotations, circled phrases, redacted names. Almost all bore the same stamp, reserved in reservary. Her fingers paused on a report filed by a courthouse janitor, a woman in her 60s. Her complaint wasn't about aggression. It was about how Keller would leer, how he blocked her path and laughed. She wrote that she felt hunted, and yet the response in the margins was just one sentence. No security footage available. Incident closed. Althea closed her eyes. This was a system, not a mistake. This was history, not happenstance. And suddenly, all those years of feeling watched in the courthouse halls, of being called sweetheart by officers who knew her title, of watching white clerks get waved through security while she was asked to show ID twice, it all clicked. She hadn't imagined it. She had simply endured it. Because that's what black women in power are conditioned to do. Endure. Absorb. Move on. But not today. Not anymore. She stood and walked toward the window, folder still in hand. Outside, the courthouse lawn looked so orderly, so quiet, like nothing had happened. But inside, in this room, inside her, the earth was shifting. She thought of Bernice, of Keisha, of the janitor with trembling hands. None of them had gotten a hearing, not a judge, not a transcript, just dismissal. She thought about the thin line between law and complicity. Then she turned, walked back to her desk. She didn't hesitate this time. She reached for her phone. No assistant, No formality, just her, the receiver, and the rising heat in her chest. 3 rings. "Office of the Inspector General," said a woman's voice on the other end. Althia's voice was steady, but her pulse thundered. "This is Judge Althia Brooks. I'm submitting an emergency request for an institutional audit of Mapleton Federal Courthouse security personnel. I have in my possession multiple suppressed complaints involving the same officer, Deputy Troy Keller, suspended over a decade. The dismissals were internal. The pattern is racial, and I believe signatures from sitting judges used to suppress legal review." The woman on the line paused, then slowly responded. "Your Honor, please submit the documentation to our secure inbox. I'll mark it as high priority." "Thank you," Althia said. "You'll have the materials in minutes." She hung up. Her hand didn't tremble. Her breath didn't hitch. She scanned the folder into the system page by page, each beep of the scanner sealing a truth that had waited far too long in the dark. The truth was out now, and it had her name on it. She stood by the scanner, watching the final page disappear into the digital void. It wasn't just data being uploaded. It was memory, pain, history sealed into light and fiber optics, unignorable. The screen flashed green. Upload complete. But nothing about her felt complete. Althia walked back to her desk and sat in silence. She looked down at her robe, the weight of it on her shoulders. It felt heavier than usual, not from shame, but from purpose. The kind of purpose that came with knowing you were about to go to war with the very building you swore an oath to protect. She opened her drawer, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and began to write. Not notes. Not a ruling. Names: Bernice Holloway, Keisha Turner, Nadine Willis, Angela Fry, Mariah Polk. She wrote until the names filled the page. 15 women. 15 moments the system decided they didn't matter. 15 doors slammed shut in silence. But they weren't just names anymore. They were witnesses, even if no one ever put them on the stand. She tore the page from the pad, folded it twice, slipped it into the inside lining of her robe near her heart. A silent promise. Not forgotten. Not this time. The room darkened slightly as the sun dipped lower outside her window. She didn't move to turn on the light. She wanted to feel it. The ending of a day that had begun with humiliation and ended with revelation. She thought of Judge Wexler again. Not with hate, with understanding. He had made a choice. And so had she. He chose silence. She chose exposure. He protected Keller. She protected the women Keller had harmed. And maybe that was what history really came down to. Not heroes and villains, but choices. Patterns broken. Silence refused. Light turned on where it had once been turned off. She leaned forward, folded her hands, and whispered softly, "No." No more winks and nods behind closed doors. No more pretending the courthouse walls were neutral. No more complicity signed in ink and handed off like paperwork. Tomorrow would bring the news cameras, the phone calls, the scrutiny. But tonight, there was only this room. Only this silence. Only the truth, blooming inside it like a storm just beginning. The courtroom was full, but no one moved. Not the journalists in the gallery, not the young law clerks pressed along the wall, not the women in the front row who had sat through every hearing without blinking. The energy in the room was not anticipation. It was gravity. Everyone understood this was not just another case, it was something deeper. A closing of something long open. A reckoning. When the side door opened and Troy Keller stepped into view, the silence became physical. He wore the standard gray jumpsuit of the county holding facility. No badges, no belt, No polished shoes, just worn sleeves, scuffed shoes, and the sagging posture of a man who had been stripped of everything that once defined him. There was no swagger left in him. His head stayed low, his wrists were cuffed in front of him, and his knuckles were red from a night spent clenching. He looked out briefly, but no one met his gaze. Even his own attorney, a court-appointed defender, didn't reach for him. The bailiff spoke quietly, "All rise." And then, as the wooden doors creaked open, Judge Althia Brooks entered. She wore the same black robe she'd worn every day of this trial. It had become something symbolic now, not just a garment of office, but a shroud of principle. Her presence didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. She sat, adjusted her robe at the shoulders, and stared directly at the defendant. There were no theatrics, only silence, deep and deliberate. This court reconvenes for the sentencing hearing in United States v. Troy Keller, she began, her voice low, deliberate. The defendant has been found guilty on all counts brought by the United States Department of Justice. She reached for a single sheet of paper, the sentencing summary. Her hands were steady. Troy Keller, you were sworn to protect this courthouse, and by extension, the public trust placed in every federal institution connected to it. Instead, over a period of more than 10 years, you systematically abused your authority to target, intimidate, and physically harm women, specifically women of color, under the false pretense of random security checks. Her voice did not waver. It didn't need to. The court has reviewed all relevant documentation, including the concealed complaints uncovered during this investigation. The court also notes the deliberate obstruction of justice through the unauthorized destruction of records, an act which compounded the initial harms and prolonged the denial of justice. Keller shifted in his seat, not to object, but because his body, his whole being, seemed to cave in under the words. He looked down, eyes tracing the grain of the table, as though he could fall into it and disappear. No one reached out for him. No one stood in his defense. His silence had protected him once. Now, it was his sentence. Althea paused, letting the stillness in the room wrap around the moment like a rope drawn tight. And then, with a breath that carried the weight of history, she said, "Sentencing will proceed." Althea leaned slightly forward. There is no sentence that can reverse what has been done. No amount of time served will erase the fear, the humiliation, or the silence forced upon those who walked through these doors, believing they would be safe. Her words were not angry. They were mournful, measured, made heavier by restraint. You were not alone in your actions. You were enabled. You were protected. But that does not lessen your responsibility. It magnifies it, because you knew the pattern. You knew the cover would hold, and still, you chose to continue. Keller's jaw twitched. He had no expression beyond the exhaustion of knowing this was the end. In the back of the courtroom, one woman covered her mouth with her hand. It was unclear if she was crying or simply overwhelmed. Althea continued, "These reasons, and in accordance with federal sentencing guidelines, this court imposes the following sentence." She read the paper slowly. 12 years in a federal correctional facility. A sharp breath escaped someone in the gallery. Althea didn't look up. There will be no eligibility for parole for the first 7 years. You will be transferred immediately into the custody of federal marshals. She folded the sentencing document, laid it flat on the bench, and looked at Keller one last time. But what she said next wasn't written. It wasn't part of the protocol. It was something more human. The ass beyond this legal proceeding, a human reckoning. The badge you once wore wasn't just a symbol of power. It was a promise to every person you stopped to uphold something larger than yourself. You broke that promise, not once, but repeatedly. And you broke it in the darkest way, with the belief that no one would care. She let those words sink in. The legal system has spoken today, but it is the voices of those women, the ones you dismissed, the ones who were never believed, who will carry this verdict further than any law book. Her voice dropped lower, and for a moment, the bench didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt like a pulpit. Justice does not always shout. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through doors it was never meant to enter. She turned to the bailiff and gave a simple nod. "Sheik him." The two marshals moved toward Keller. They did not rush. They didn't touch him roughly. But when they fastened the secondary cuffs and led him to his feet, the final click of steel echoed louder than it should have. It sounded like punctuation. As he was led through the center aisle, he didn't look at anyone. Not the judge, not the audience, not the attorney who hadn't said a word all morning. The courtroom watched in silence. Not because they'd been asked to, but because they needed to. It was history happening, slow, solemn, and without spectacle. And the man who once held the power to silence others now disappeared without making a sound. When the courtroom doors shut behind Keller, it felt like something larger closed with him. Althia remained seated. The space he had vacated, the chair, the table, the silence, felt heavier than when he sat there, as if absence carried a deeper weight than presence ever could. Her clerk approached, quietly placing the next docket on her bench. A routine gesture, another day's business. But she didn't reach for it. Not yet. Her hands rested gently over the sealed folder that contained the verdict summary and the final witness testimonies. She looked down at it for a long moment, then stood. Slowly, deliberately. She stepped away from the bench, not to leave, but to acknowledge. She walked to the clerk's desk and retrieved a folded sheet of paper from the inside pocket of her robe. 15 names, written in ink, in her own hand. Each one belonged to a woman who had once written a complaint that vanished into the system like smoke. Bernice, Keisha, Mariah, Angela. She placed the page on the desk, said nothing, and turned. She walked down the aisle of the courtroom, past pews filled with people who had watched every moment. Some had tears in their eyes, others held their breath. A few bowed their heads, not in prayer, but in reverence. She did not speak. She did not smile. But she made eye contact with everyone she passed, and what they saw in her was not triumph. It was testimony. When she reached the gallery door, she turned back once, looked at the room as if seeing it for the first time. The courtroom hadn't changed, but it had been changed. Not by one sentence, not even by one trial, but by the decision of a woman who refused to let silence finish the story. Outside, the skies had begun to open. A soft rain fell across the courthouse steps, tapping the stone like a soft drumbeat. She stepped into it without hesitation. She didn't run for cover, didn't open an umbrella. She let it touch her. Let it soak into the fabric of her robe, the roots of her hair, the skin of her hands. She walked to the edge of the stone platform and looked out at the city. People passed by, some recognizing her, most not. But the courthouse behind her stood taller than it had that morning, and the ground beneath her feet felt honest. Not because justice had been served in full, but because, for once, it hadn't been denied. The next Monday morning arrived with sunlight pouring through the courthouse atrium. It wasn't loud, it wasn't announced, but it felt different. Reporters waited outside, not in a frenzy, but in quiet anticipation. There were no sirens, no shouts, just a sense that something was about to change, not just in this building, but in the systems that surrounded it. Inside courtroom 12, the seats filled quickly. Students in clean collars, advocates with notebooks, community elders who had shown up every day for the last week, their faces lined with experience and witness. Judge Althia Brooks sat at the bench already. The robe she wore was the same, but something about the way it moved, the way it hung from her shoulders, made it feel newly sacred. On her desk lay a manila folder, no case files, no motions, no sentences. Just a single policy document, printed in black and white. "Recognizes Judge Brooks," the clerk said formally. Althia stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This morning we submit to record the Monroe Doctrine," she said. A murmur passed through the gallery, but no one spoke. She continued, eyes scanning the pages, hands steady. "The doctrine, named in honor of Judge Celeste Monroe, who herself faced unlawful force in her own courtroom, will be adopted into local federal procedures and proposed for state-level integration." Her voice didn't tremble. It soared, not with volume, but with certainty. Monroe Doctrine mandates the following. All courthouse law enforcement officers must complete annual anti-bias training certified by an independent civil rights panel. An external complaint review board will be established, comprising civilian oversight and rotating federal ethics counsel. All misconduct allegations will be documented publicly and archived for no less than 10 years. She paused. The judiciary cannot shield itself from scrutiny and expect to deserve public trust. This court does not serve order at the expense of truth. This court will not protect silence when that silence is used to bury harm. Her voice deepened slightly. This doctrine is not vengeance. It is not punishment. It is protection of dignity, of law, and of the principle that justice must be transparent, not convenient. In the gallery, no one shifted. There were no murmurs now. No typing. Just breath. The kind people hold when they realize they are witnessing something real. Althea gently placed the printed doctrine back on her bench. She didn't look for reaction. She didn't perform for the room. She sat back straight, eyes forward, hands resting on the wooden surface like they were holding memory. In the front row, a woman wearing a shirt that read, "Protect Black Women," wiped a tear from her cheek. She wasn't sobbing, just witnessing. Another man, a young father who had brought his daughter every day to watch history unfold, leaned forward and whispered to her. "It's what leadership looks like," he said softly. Althea's assistant approached the bench and laid down a folder. It contained a list of names, individuals volunteering for the first external complaint board, professors, civil rights attorneys, survivors, a retired police officer who had spoken openly about internal reform. It was happening. Not symbolically. Not as a press release, but systemically. She nodded as she looked through the list. "This board will report quarterly to the District Ethics Committee," she announced. "Each case reviewed will receive a written outcome and be published to the court's website for public record." It was a sentence unlike any ever spoken from that bench. And yet it was necessary. Long overdue. Outside, a small gathering had formed beneath the courthouse steps. There were no chants, no megaphones, just people holding signs. Simple signs. "Protect Black women." "We believe her." "Accountability now." Some held hands. Others took photos not for the internet, but for history books. They knew what this moment meant. It wasn't a victory lap. It was a siege. Inside, Althea adjusted the collar of her robe, leaned toward her microphone, and gave one final declaration. The federal courthouse security officers employed under the jurisdiction of this court will be recertified under the new doctrine before the end of the fiscal year. Any failure to comply will result in immediate suspension, pending review. A murmur, then a stillness. She looked up, met the eyes of her clerk, her law students, the mother in the third row, the intern holding back tears, all of them watching something shift. Not just one trial ending, but a culture breaking open. And from the silence that followed came reverence. The gallery rose, not in applause, not in protest, but in solemn agreement. A shared understanding. The institution, for once, was listening, and the people it served were not invisible. After court adjourned, Althea did not return to her chambers right away. She stood at the edge of the bench, scanning the room. She saw everyone, and they saw her, not as untouchable, not as an icon, but as a woman who had stood her ground and pulled the system with her. The bailiff, a newer hire, approached her quietly. He extended his hand. "I wanted to say," he began, "that what you did, it changes things." Althea took his hand, nodded once, and replied, "Only if we keep going." He nodded too. No more words, just understanding. She left the courtroom by the front doors again. Outside, the air smelled like jasmine and summer grass. Sunlight washed across the courthouse steps, where a crowd had now grown to nearly 100. Not a mob, not a spectacle, just citizens, survivors, students, retired judges, advocates, reporters. They parted as she descended. She didn't wave. She didn't pose. She walked, slowly, with presence. Someone handed her a single white rose. She accepted it, touched the petals lightly, and tucked it beneath her arm. A young girl, maybe 10, stood near the railing and asked shyly, "Are you the one who made the rules?" Althea turned to her and knelt. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "I'm the one who finally said them out loud." The girl beamed. "Then you're my favorite judge." Althea smiled, not broadly, but from somewhere deep and quiet. She rose, turned back toward the courthouse, and looked at the flag now hanging still in the breeze. It hadn't changed, but the ground beneath it had. She stepped away from the crowd toward a waiting car. Before getting in, she paused once more. Behind her, the courthouse doors remained open. The same place that had once tried to reduce her now bore her fingerprints, in law, in policy, in precedent. She opened the car door, but before she sat, she said one more thing, just under her breath. "We are not here to survive this. We are here to change it." She got in, closed the door, and the car pulled away, quietly, purposefully. In her lap, the rose stayed untouched. In her eyes, no tears. Just forward. Because the work had only begun. It was early. The kind of morning where the sky held onto the last grip of night, and fog curled across the earth like it had secrets to protect. The courthouse stood tall in it, its marble steps barely visible, as if suspended between one era and the next. Judge Althia Brooks stood at the window in her chambers, a cup of black coffee cooling in her hand. Though she hadn't taken a sip, her gaze stretched outward through the mist. On the lawn, despite the hour, people had gathered. Not the angry mobs or camera-chasing crowds that had once swarmed the building. These were quieter, purposeful. A teacher with 2 students, an older woman with silver braids, leaning on a walker. A group of young activists, notebooks in hand, standing shoulder to shoulder, with their eyes fixed on the courthouse doors. And at the front, there she was. A young black girl, 13 maybe. Wearing a denim jacket, one sleeve rolled up, she stood still, looking straight toward Althea's window. Not with awe, not with questions, but with knowing. A silent, powerful knowing that traveled across the glass like a vow. She nodded once. Althea felt it in her chest. It wasn't pride. It was something deeper, a recognition, a torch being passed, not because she had finished the race, but because she had made it safe for others to start running. She stepped back from the window, heart steady, breath slow. The robe hung on its hook in the corner. She walked over to it, reached out, and ran her hand along the sleeve. How many times had she worn it under pressure, under surveillance, under threat? It had once felt like armor, necessary, heavy. Now, it felt like something else. Not a shield, a banner. Not something to hide in, but something to raise. She took it down gently, folded it in half, then into quarters, pressing out the creases with deliberate care. She placed it in a wooden box carved with symbols of balance and justice. Inside the lid was an inscription she had chosen long ago, not knowing how prophetic it would be. Through the front door, Althia ran her fingers over the carved words, her eyes soft. The clock ticked behind her, indifferent and eternal. She closed the box, locking it, not to seal something away, but to prepare it for what came next. Because justice, when it begins, does not end in robes or trials. It lives in what we hand to those who follow. Althia's chambers were still as she moved through them. She picked up a small leather journal from her shelf. Its spine was creased, its corners worn. It was one of the few things she had never shown anyone. Inside were years of handwritten thoughts, observations, names, things she didn't want to forget. The first page had only initials, women whose complaints had been dismissed, whispers on paper, names lost in files that someone else had buried. She flipped through pages covered in inked memories, of hearings, moments of injustice, reforms delayed by bureaucracy, and the burden of seeing too much while being asked to say too little. Near the middle was a page dated from the day she had sentenced Keller. She had written, "Justice is not what we say in court, it's what we fight for when no one's looking." Today she would write one last sentence. She picked up her pen and carefully pressed it to the last blank line. "We carry the gavel in our hearts." She closed the book. She didn't need to write more. She didn't need to explain what had been earned. She stepped toward the hallway, and as she walked, a memory returned, fragmented but vivid. The hallway that day. Keller's hand. The way he gripped her ID as if it were disposable. The way no one stopped him. And the way she had swallowed it all, not out of fear but strategy. That same hallway now looked different. Not because the marble had changed, not because the lights were softer, but because she had reclaimed it. There had been no dramatic apology, no news anchor naming her as a hero, no statewide parade, just policy, action, and a new doctrine with her fingerprints pressed into its spine. She reached the door to the courtroom and paused. She didn't need to go inside today. Court was not in session. The bench was empty. But behind that door, history had been shifted. And she had not just witnessed it, she had shaped it. Outside, the crowd was growing, quiet, respectful. Some held handmade signs, some wore shirts with the words "unbroken" or "justice is not silent." She straightened her blazer, pressed her palms flat against her sides, and stepped into the corridor. The sound of her shoes echoed, not with weight, but with presence. The lobby was nearly empty, but it felt like a sanctuary. As Althia walked through the vast atrium of the courthouse, the overhead skylight poured sunlight across the marble floor, scattering soft reflections like quiet blessings. Each step she took echoed, not harshly, but clearly. There was no rush, no tension, just presence. The kind of presence earned, not declared. To her left, the young security officer from that morning stood near the scanner. She met Althia's gaze for a split second, then nodded, humbled. There were no words between them, but in that gesture, there was an apology, a reckoning, a vow to do better. Althia nodded back. At the large brass doors that led to the outside steps, she paused. Through the deviled glass, She could see them, more people now, gathered with signs, standing in quiet rows, shoulder to shoulder. Some held sunflowers, others held one another, and just beyond them, camera crews waited, but far back held at a distance by invisible boundaries of respect. She opened the door and stepped outside. The sun had finally burned through the fog. It was warm now, not hot, but golden, soft. The kind of light that doesn't blind, but blesses. The crowd turned. There were no chants, no cheers, no slogans screamed. Just reverence. A stillness so complete it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. A little boy, no older than 6, stood beside his father with a cardboard sign that read, "My future deserves fairness." The boy didn't know what all of it meant, but his eyes lit up when he saw her, not because of her title, but because of what she symbolized. The quiet courage to confront injustice. The proof that standing up didn't always mean shouting. Near the bottom of the stairs, 3 young girls stood in matching shirts that read, "Protect Black Women." One of them had drawn the image of a gavel over her heart. Another had her phone raised, recording, but she wasn't aiming for viral fame. She was preserving history. A woman with salt and pepper braids stepped forward slowly, a bouquet of sunflowers trembling in her hands. "Inspire. They are for you," she said softly. "From all of us who couldn't speak when it was our turn." Althea accepted them with both hands, holding them close to her chest. No speech. No statement. Only grace. She walked down the last few steps as if descending from a burden, not a throne, each football softer than the last. A reporter, held back by the crowd, lifted a microphone. "Judge Brooks," he called, "do you have any comment?" She stopped. He turned slightly and said, not with fire, but with finality, "A day." Then she faced forward once more. At the sidewalk, a young girl no older than the one in the courthouse window stepped into her path. Her eyes were wide and awestruck, but she didn't ask for a picture, didn't ask for her name. Instead, she said quietly, "Are you the one who changed the rules?" Althea looked down at her. "No," she said, "I'm just the one who refused to keep them hidden." The girl smiled, tucking her hair behind her ear, then stepped aside respectfully. Althea turned to look back at the courthouse one last time. The stone steps, the tall windows, the institution she had once feared would swallow her whole. And then she whispered, just to herself, "Robe was never the power." And she walked forward, into the light, because the battle wasn't over. But someone had finally dared to begin it.